About a few months ago, I put out a video detailing my first foray into a video game genre I wasn't very well versed in, survival horror. I began that journey with Resident Evil 3, a game that I had some childhood history with. And while I wouldn't necessarily say it was the best start, it did get me interested in checking out the franchise as a whole. For a long time, Resident Evil was the one Capcom franchise I couldn't ever see myself getting into, but in the course of the last few months that has changed, and I've come to appreciate why this is such a popular game series. In my journey through the Resident Evil games, I originally planned to stick to the classics, with Resident Evil 5 set as my initial stopping point. However, after playing and really enjoying some of the original games that blew the franchise up, I started getting interested in their remakes. I know that the gameplay of Resident Evil has changed dramatically over the years, and with some of these remakes being decades separated from their originals, I really wanted to compare them and see which ones I ended up liking more. Now, I'm a newcomer to the survival horror genre, so by no means am I coming to this with an expert opinion. In general, I prefer JRPGs, platformers, and adventure-style games, and while Resident Evil certainly has a lot of aspects I like, I fully expect my opinions to not be reflective of the fandom as a whole. Even so, I found a lot to like while playing these games, and I feel like using this as a way to go over what made those classic games so good. We start in 1996 with the original Resident Evil, where the members of STARS' Alpha team investigate a string of bizarre murders in the Arklay forest. Assaulted by monstrous dogs, a number of their members are forced to shelter in a mysterious mansion, though the danger hasn't ended there. The mansion is full of zombies, and either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine has to brave its horrors in order to find a way out. As the first game in this series, Resident Evil is a rather short experience, something you could probably knock out in 6 to 8 hours even if you don't know what you're doing. In my opinion, that actually serves it really well as an introduction to the series. Zombies are sparse and pretty easy to dodge, and because the areas are small, it's hard to get lost. You quickly start to understand that resources are scarce, and learning to dodge zombies rather than risk combat is actually a lot of fun. I'll be honest, I didn't expect to like Resident Evil as much as I did, but there's something about the snappiness and swiftness of the game that really appealed to me. I'm no speedrunner, but figuring out the best way to dash through a room with zombies without wasting ammo was honestly a lot of fun. And while the tank controls did mix me up occasionally, I still found the game to be an incredible experience overall. Now, the story goes that while Resident Evil was a massive success, director Shinji Mikami didn't believe that he was able to do the concept justice at the time. So, he remade the game in 2002, which makes it pretty unique among the Resident Evil remakes, as not only was it fairly close to its original, it was still made during the franchise's classic survival horror era. As a result, it is a much more faithful game, to the point that a lot of areas of the mansion are nearly one-to-one. Not that there aren't changes to the game at all, because there certainly are. The structure of the mansion is slightly different in certain areas, and there are completely new areas that never existed in the original at all. We get some new mechanics such as the defensive weapons, which can be used to escape from a zombie if it grabs you, as well as some quality of life changes, such as the map that changes colors if you've grabbed every item in a particular room. All in all though, Resident Evil Remake is simply a refined version of its original in almost every way, and it's not hard to think of the original as somewhat obsolete. I have to say though, there's one thing that the remake deviated strongly from the original on, and that is its vibes. The remake is a lot more serious and dramatic in its mood compared to the original, which certainly had a more B-movie energy to it.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
I played the GOG version based on the PC port of the original RE, which meant that I also got to watch the goofy live-action FMVs included in that version of the game. Added all together, there's a campiness to the original that's just gone from the remake, and while that doesn't make it worse, I do sort of miss it. All in all, while I can admit that the remake is simply a better game, the exhilaration and excitement of running through the original is still a strong memory, and I can't imagine telling anyone to skip it. The success of Resident Evil naturally prompted the release of a sequel, and so came Resident Evil 2 in 1998. Now set in Raccoon City, we follow either rookie police officer Leon Kennedy or college student Claire Redfield, the sister of RE1's Chris, as they are stranded in the city following a zombie outbreak caused by the Umbrella Corporation's experiments. Resident Evil 2 is commonly considered to be one of the best games in the franchise, and it's not hard to see why. Gameplay-wise, RE2 is essentially the first game, but bigger and more refined. The main area this time around is the Raccoon City police station, and it alone is much larger and more complex than the mansion ever was. Zombies are more numerous, and the variety of monsters you encounter has increased as well. The plot lines of both characters are a lot more involved and can change depending on the order you experience their scenarios. More on that later. There's not a lot I can say about Resident Evil 2 that I didn't already say about the first game. It certainly makes its improvements, but everything that was good about the first is just as good in the second, whether it be the puzzles or the level design. It's certainly a game that expands and builds upon the original, and its main draw is definitely that it does a better job of making its good qualities clear compared to its predecessor. Unlike the first Resident Evil, RE2 didn't get a remake until 2019, more than 2 decades later. By this point, we're post Resident Evil 4, so third-person shooter elements have been present in the franchise for a while. However, I personally felt that while Resident Evil 2 Remake was certainly more action-focused, it still stuck pretty faithfully to the survival horror conventions the series was based on. Resource management was still very important, and dodging past zombies was still a big part of getting through that game without wasting too much ammo. Of course, the remake adds a lot of mechanics that the original didn't have, such as ammo crafting, which first appeared in Resident Evil 3, but for some reason didn't appear to show up again until this game. Defensive weapons are also back, which I definitely appreciated a lot more this time around. And of course, being able to play the game with a movable over-the-shoulder camera instead of a fixed one changes a lot as well. Fans of the series may flame me for this, but I honestly ended up liking RE2's remake more than the original. Not by a lot, mind you. The two games do have a lot of common, so there's not a big gap between the two in my mind. However, if there's one thing that really gives the remake the edge for me, it's Mr. X. Mr. X only really appears in the B scenario of the original RE2, and to be honest, he's kind of a pushover there. In the remake, however, he's a constant presence, chasing you wherever you go, and while it's pretty simple to get away from him, it really made the experience of running through the police station feel tense in a way I don't think the original was ever able to do. There is one thing the remake gets a bit of flack on, and it's the lack of the zapping system originally included as a part of the original's dual scenarios. In the original, certain actions you took in the first scenario would change aspects in the second scenario. I understand why fans of the original would bemoan its loss, but to be honest, I find the zapping system to be a little bit overrated. I know that RE2 is an older game, but the list of things actually affected by the zapping system is incredibly small, and there's nothing that would considerably change the flow of each scenario. I do think it's true that the remake scenarios are a little too homogenized, but not to the point that it would seriously affect my enjoyment of the game. Either way, I consider both games outright classics, and absolute must-plays for anyone interested in the series. Resident Evil 2 was quickly followed up by Resident Evil 3 in 1999. Also set in Raccoon City during the zombie outbreak, we follow Jill Valentine from the first game as she attempts to escape the city on her own. This game is even bigger than the last two, as you are given the run of the entire city rather than a handful of enclosed areas. It's almost open world in its design, which certainly makes it a very unique experience. You could spend a lot of the early game just exploring the environment, scrounging for resources and vital items along the way. RE3 is also even more action focused than its predecessors, with Jill now being able to dodge zombies that attempt to grab her. This is both a good thing and a bad thing for me. While I like being able to dodge, I would have preferred it if it was on a dedicated button. It being on the same buttons you use to shoot kind of makes dodges feel more accidental rather than intentional, and I never really got the hang of it while playing. In general, RE3 feels to me like it pushes players towards a more combat-focused gameplay style. Crafting ammunition is introduced in this game, and it's a big help because there are more zombies and more forced big boss encounters than ever before. Of course, we can't talk about RE3 without talking about Nemesis, the Mr. X of the game. Nemesis stalks you from area to area, hunting you down, and it can make scavenging through Raccoon City incredibly stressful. He's also much hardier than Mr. X, so fighting him, while an option, isn't going to be that easy. To be honest, while I like a lot about RE3, that focus on combat is what ultimately makes me like it less than the previous two games. What attracted me to Resident Evil and the survival horror genre was its focus on puzzle solving and resource management over shooting a bunch of zombies in the face. There are still plenty of avoidable or easily solvable encounters in RE3, but the ones that weren't certainly put a damper on the game for me. Even Nemesis became more of an annoyance by the end of the game. Add to that the consistently unwieldy tank controls, and I just couldn't really get a handle on the combat. All that said, it's a far sight better than its remake, which also came out quickly after the remake of RE2 in 2020. Remember when I mentioned how the early game has you exploring the entirety of Raccoon City? Well, the remake cuts all that out for a cinematic sequence that lands you roughly 1/3 of the way into the original game, barely 20 minutes in. It's a massive chunk just cut out of the story, and unfortunately, it's not the only time that happens. Resident Evil 3 Remake, ultimately, is a very pared down and streamlined version of its original, which is probably the worst game to pick to do this to. Nearly all of the exploration is ripped out for a more linear, story-focused experience that honestly feels like a Telltale game at times. Entire segments of the original game are just gone, and what's new, including an expanded Carlos segment, barely fills the holes left behind. The biggest crime is probably what the remake did to Nemesis. Once a real threat that could appear out of literally nowhere, Nemesis is now almost entirely scripted, with only a very short part of the game where he acts as he did in the original. Every other encounter is either a scripted cinematic sequence or a boss fight, which is far less effective compared to the role he used to play. It's such a disappointment just because Nemesis is the biggest part of RE3, and he's effectively neutered. While I won't go as far to say that Resident Evil 3 Remake is a bad game, it's certainly disappointing and much worse than its original. Finally, we're at what some might consider the best Resident Evil game and possibly even the best video game of all time, Resident Evil 4, which released in 2005 and basically codified the third-person shooter genre. It follows an older Leon Kennedy as he attempts to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, from a religious cult in Spain. Resident Evil 4 pivots the franchise from survival horror to action, with more emphasis on combat and shooting over resource management and puzzle solving. To be honest, this is kind of a disappointment to me. To be fair, I've just spent the last few games learning to avoid encounters and hoard resources, only for RE4 to turn around and basically tell me to do the direct opposite. You're now forced into battles against waves of enemies, and if you want to survive, you're gonna have to fight. It's such a change in direction that it's hard to really adjust, and I honestly believe that had I put some more distance between the more classically survival horror Resident Evils and this, I would have had a better time of it. I also have to admit that I'm not a big fan of shooters in general, with the main reason being that my aim is terrible. I've tried to play a lot of different kinds of shooters over the years, but my aim has genuinely never gotten better. That certainly made RE4 much more of a struggle for me, even if that's not really the game's fault. I don't want the takeaway from all this to be that I didn't like RE4 though, because I still did. The game is even bigger than RE3, which is a pain at times, but it does make for some fun exploration every now and then as well. There are a lot of silly set pieces and sequences, and managing my inventory space is honestly an enjoyable puzzle in itself. There's one core mechanic that can be somewhat divisive when it comes to RE4, and that's Ashley. Ashley turns big parts of the game into glorified escort missions, and so there are a lot of points where you have to fight waves of enemies while also keeping her out of trouble. This can be tough since Ashley has no way of defending herself, and if she gets taken too far away, the game is over. While frustrating, I never really felt too negative about this aspect of the game because there are a lot of ways to keep Ashley safe, and while her character is certainly one note, I never found myself disliking her. Once I got used to it, the combat was also pretty fun. Resident Evil's transition from survival horror to shooter went pretty smoothly in my opinion. Shooting feels really good, and while the movement is still kind of janky, the overall feel of blasting away zombies was pretty fun. I still prefer the classic style of Resident Evil overall, but RE4 still makes a good case for a more action-focused gameplay design. Considering the accolades of Resident Evil 4, I assumed the remake that came out in 2023 wouldn't change too much. In some ways, I was right, but there honestly were a few changes and adjustments here and there, such as being able to parry chainsaws with your knife. Resident Evil 4 Remake is, for the most part, just as good as its predecessor, but there are some aspects here and there that make me like it a little less. One thing that really stood out to me as a negative is the inclusion of ammo crafting. Now, since they were in the remakes for 2 and 3, it only stands to follow that they're in 4 too, right? However, ammo crafting is, for some reason, way more cumbersome in RE4 Remake, and it mostly comes down to how obnoxiously large some of the pieces you need for crafting can be. For whatever reason, they don't stack either, so you're either forced to leave vital resources behind or use up sparse inventory space to hold crafting materials. I don't have proof of this, but I feel like the addition of ammo crafting also gave Capcom an excuse to reduce the amount of ammo drops you got, as I felt like I was constantly running out. It's a small thing, but it really dragged down the experience of the game for me. Other things just include the overall vibe of the game, which is more serious compared to the original. There are still a few quips here and there, and I won't say the remake doesn't have any charm, but the original had a sense of humor that doesn't really exist anymore. It's another small thing, but it's one that does make a bit of a difference for me. I do think the remake handles Ashley just a little bit better though, both as a character and in gameplay. She's a more likable companion in the remake, and babysitting her in combat is less of a chore thanks to her no longer having a health bar. Other characters like Ada and Luis also get a little more focus, which does help to broaden the world of Resident Evil for me. Ultimately, while I don't think anyone playing Resident Evil 4 Remake would find it lacking, the original just edges it out for me. There's no nostalgia here either. I just think the game works better overall. While the remake does have its benefits, I think the original is a better experience. So that's all 4 original games along with their remakes. If you need a refresher, I ended up preferring the remakes for RE1 and 2, but the originals for RE3 and 4. These might not be very popular opinions, but I didn't make this video because I wanted people to agree with me. I made this video because I wanted to share my experience with these games that I really have come to like, despite my distaste of horror and gore. It's opened my eyes up to what the genre has to offer, and I can't wait to experience more. Thanks for watching. This is easily the longest video I've ever done, and I'm curious to see if people would be interested in seeing more content like this. I'd probably still do a lot of the short form videos I've been doing, but I wouldn't mind doing more stuff like this if there's demand for it. If you do want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you want to catch what I've got coming out next, and I'll see you next time.